In this video, I'd like to talk about the business cycle and gross domestic product. How do we measure our economy? So I'll start with gross domestic product. So we abbreviate gross domestic product with three letters: GDP, gross domestic product. So what we have here is a measurement of a way to measure economic growth. GDP measures economic growth. In a way, it's essentially saying how much product does a country produce. So if we have country A, and they are producing, so this is country A, I'll just leave that with an A, and if they are producing 300 cars, then their gross domestic, their GDP will be whatever the value of these 3,000 cars are. Let's say each car is worth $1,000. Then their gross domestic product is going to be 300 times 1,000, which is going to be 300,000. $300,000 is their GDP. If we have country B, and country B is producing bikes, but the bikes are valued at $2,000 each. Let's say they're producing 300 bikes, but the bikes are valued at $2,000 each. Then the country's GDP is going to be 300 times 2,000, or 600,000. So country B is producing more valuable product and thus giving more GDP. If we look at there's some problems with GDP. One of them is inflation. 20 years ago, the movie ticket prices cost far less than they do these days. So if we have movie ticket prices in, let's see here, if we have movie ticket prices in 1992, let's say that movie ticket prices were only $5 per person. However, in 2012, the movie prices are now valued at $10 per person. This rise in prices is called inflation. Inflation is the general increasing in prices. Increase in price over time. So the gross domestic product does not account for a rise in inflation. So the GDP in a couple of years might be $600,000 because cars are now priced at $200,000 or at $2,000. Bikes here might be now priced at only possibly $3,000, and now the GDP is going to be $900,000, even though no economic growth has taken place. So what we do then is we created something called real GDP. We created real GDP. Real GDP essentially means GDP accounting for inflation. GDP that accounts for inflation is called real GDP. So in our example here, if the cars are now, a year later, if the cars are now valued at $2,000 and the GDP has not actually increased, we are just seeing an increase in inflation. One more problem with GDP is that it does not account for a difference in population. If countries such as China and India and the United States, which have massive populations of over 1 billion people, then what are we going to do? Because they cannot compete with smaller countries such as Luxembourg and Germany and France, which have relatively small populations compared to these giant countries. So in order to account for that, we created something called real GDP, GDP per capita. Real GDP per capita. So that what this per capita means is essentially per person. So this is real GDP per person. Per person. So what this real GDP per person means is that the countries such as if country A, going back to our example over here, if country A was much larger than country B, their real GDP per capita might be much less than country B. If they're depending on their real GDP per capita. Okay, now let's take a look at something called the business cycle. The business cycle. The business cycle is essentially basically a trend is basically showing what we are going through right now, recessions and periods of economic growth and inflation. So let's draw it really quickly here. So what it essentially looks like is we have two axes. This axis here, this is real GDP, and this axis here, this is time. This is confusing because normally time this is the measure of real GDP. It's not like our other graphs in which this one's fairly straightforward. The next thing I'm going to draw is essentially what our curves look like. They essentially look like a sinusoid. So if I draw the curve, it looks essentially like a sinusoid would in math. Then I'm going to draw a second line. This line is called the growth trend line. So this is showing the fluctuation in real GDP, and this line that I drew here, this interestingly colored line, is called the growth trend line. Essentially what this is telling us is that over time our real GDP is steadily increasing. Now if we look at these different points here, this right here, this point above here, any point on here, this is called the peak. This is the peak. And this right here, the points in the very bottom, are called the trough. So if this is the peak, then these points down here are the trough. These are periods of not actually economic growth. These are periods of inflation. This is periods of inflation. That's what this line here is for, or anything above the line is called inflation. Anything below the line, opposite of that, is going to be unemployment. Unemployment. We can also relate this back to our production possibilities curve. We draw our production possibilities curve here, and if we look right here, anywhere, this right here is full employment. Now this line here also matches this line here. this line is called full. This is a full employment. Full employment. Full employment. Now, anything inside the production possibilities curve, this is full employment. Anything inside the production possibilities curve is unemployment. So this is unemployment. Anything inside this point here. Anything outside this curve is essentially before we called it unattainable. Unattainable. But now what we're going to call it is, we're not going to call it unattainable. We're actually going to call it, attainable. This is going to be called attainable. For a short period of time. This is attainable for a short period of time. We can sustain this point over here, this point here, for some time. We can't sustain it for forever, because this is using up all of our resources and then some. This can be compared to finals week in a college exam, when you are essentially staying up till midnight every night studying for these exams. You can't stay up till midnight every night, but you can stay up till midnight maybe 2 or 3 nights. After that, you have to come back down to whatever you can normally do. So this is the GDP. This is how we're measuring our economic growth. Essentially, this is goal number 2 of macroeconomics. This is goal number 1 of macroeconomics. I'm sorry, is to promote economic growth. So this is how we measure whether we have whether our economy has grown.